to start by thanking all of you for being here. It's a very distinguished crowd, but particular thanks are really due to Kari, the President and the Vice President of Kari, the Director, Dr. Veros, Ambassador Petera, and Maria Lafage, who made all of this possible. We'll be discussing this visit of mine here, which is more for my benefit than yours, I think, because it is my first time in Argentina. So I am really spending a week here understanding the political, economic climate and society. So it is really I who should be thanking Kai very, very much for this opportunity. But I would also like to say that apart from giving me an opportunity to come here, Kai is growingly getting involved in something that has been a critical part of Fundación Getulio Vargas, my own institution's goals in the past 2 years, which is to gradually motivate and create more cooperation between think tanks in the region. I find that this is a very important moment to talk about these things because Foreign Minister Patriota, that Ambassador Petera mentioned himself, had made it an object of our Brazilian foreign policy to decentralize and to open space for think tanks and for civil society and non-governmental actors to begin to debate with Itamaraty, the foreign ministry, to create space for the introduction of ideas, something that is unprecedented in Brazilian foreign policy. For whoever knows Itamaraty, it is a very competent, very traditional, and very bureaucratic and strong institution. So the opening that Foreign Minister Patriota made to civil society, personally even, but also by supporting the publication of articles in the press, by organizing in his own home at time meetings with members of think tanks, shows that there was a realization from the part of Brazilian foreign policy for the need of academics, think tankers, former diplomats to contribute ideas. And particularly not on the national level, but also transnationally getting involved with each other. So our cooperation with Kari actually began, our contact with Kari began under the umbrella of bringing think tanks together. Not in the region, but it began with an idea of bringing together think tanks of the G20. We met with Ambassador Petera last summer, or winter, in the United States in an attempt to bring think tanks of the G20 together. And most recently, we had a meeting of Latin American think tanks in Rio. And I really hope that this discussion among us can also feed into the policy debates in all countries, because it has been proven to be a mechanism that enables procedures in foreign policy, creates basis to deal with complex problems together. So thank you for making this visit of mine a part of this. Now, I will not say a lot about Fundación Getulio Vargas. I hope that you are aware of it. If not, we have failed in trying to promote who we are in the region. It is an old institution in Brazil. It was founded in 1944. It is the biggest think tank in Brazil and in the university. And within it, we have a very small component since 2008, which is the Center for International Relations, which is our first attempt to deal with international affairs, not strictly under a trade and economics perspective, as the Foundation has traditionally done, but also to bring in debates about politics, security, norms, values, so to look at international affairs in a wider perspective and not necessarily just trade and economic development, which have been the Foundation's basis. The center is small, but it is growing, and we are working very much with the President of the Fundación to extend our links in the region and globally. And I hope we're doing a good job. Now, today's talk is about the EU, Brazil, and Latin America. I hope it is a subject of interest. I have to say, I am not an expert in Latin America, I'm an expert in Europe. But in the past 2.5 years, we have been working at the center together with counterparts in Europe on a project regarding the future of the EU's relations with Brazil, but also understanding significant changes that have happened in the relationship under the current environment. The environment which includes the crisis in the EU, the changes that have come about because of it, but also the so-called emergence of Brazil, the triumphalism of the first decade of the 2000s about the economic emergence of Brazil, the environment that includes the BRICS, but also many elements that we now see fading, such as the commodities boom that led Brazil's economy to where it is. So I will speak about the present mostly, running in the last decade that runs up to the present. And I will focus on the EU and Brazil, which has been our project, and I hope is of interest today. But I will also bring in later the element of Latin America, as it is crucial to understand EU-Brazil relations, how Latin America comes in various moments and in various forms, both economically but also in terms of a region that can work or cannot work together. In doing so, I'm hoping that today we can address some more wider questions, such as, is Latin America becoming relevant, as has been hailed at times during this past decade? You mentioned The Economist. I remember the cover of The Economist, which reversed the map. It was maybe 3 years ago, and put Latin America on top and the North America on the south. Yes. So, is this something that is here to stay? Was that an opportunity that was grasped? Was that an opportunity that was missed? And if so, why? Is it still there? I think this is a question that can be linked to this issue and is also relevant for Argentina and Brazil likewise. The second question, of course, is about Europe and its crisis. And again, I remember various Economist covers. It does have this tendency to stick to your mind, like the Eiffel Tower falling down and the like. The question about Europe is, have we misunderstood this crisis? It was, again, in what I like to call the Goldman Sachs trap of thinking that the world was completely reversed in the first decade of the 2000s, perceived as an actor that is becoming less relevant. And it's interesting because I gave a similar talk a year ago, and I was referring to that as an objective fact. Europe is becoming irrelevant. But now we're seeing signs of recovery, and we're also seeing contradictory trends in the global economy and global politics. So how should we evaluate Europe in the global setting? How should we evaluate it as an actor? And what does that tell us about relations between the EU, Brazil, and Latin America? How does it impact trade relations, economic relations? And also, linked to that is the discussion on what is Europe, what is the EU, and what is its future like? And I say that because apart from the external aspects of it, this crisis has been an identity crisis for the European Union. Part of the research we've been carrying out is discussing EU-Brazil relations in the national capitals of major EU member states, not just in Brussels. And it is surprising how much of a retreat to national foreign policies one can sense after this crisis. How much the EU element is becoming less relevant. How much EU member states are returning to the politics of national interest. So what kind of the EU are we talking with? And in relation to that, who should Brazil and Latin America be talking to when they're talking to the EU? Should it be Brussels? Or should we focus more on London, Berlin, Paris? And what do we do with those EU member states that don't have a tradition of relating to Latin America? There are EU member states that never had a Latin America foreign policy. The Eastern European states, some of the southern states. How do these play in if the EU as a whole does not have a foreign policy? How do Argentina and Brazil work with these states? So that's another issue about Europe. A third general point is, what does all of this change mean for global governance, and how do relations between the EU and this continent play into the global and multilateral institutions that currently characterize the international environment? Is there a way to work together in reforms? Will there be reforms? What is the role of the G20 going to be? And here we have both the EU but 3 Latin American states playing into the global picture. And also, is regionalism going to be a part of the architecture of global governance? So will this region work together in the way that the EU is, and will interregionalism lead these 2 entities, Latin America and the EU, to work together in the construction of global governance? So that's the issue. Finally, there is the wider issue of what is this world that we are in right now? Is it multipolar? Is it apolar? Is it post-Western? Is it post-American? all these Farid Zakaria, Serfati, Charles Kupcha characterizations and attempts to define the current scenario. Where do the EU, where do Brazil and Latin America fit in this? How do we choose our partners and our allies under these circumstances? For whoever is an academic, and I don't know how many here are academics, there has been very little written about how to choose allies in a non-polar world, in partners. And a bit more, but still significantly little, about how to choose them under a multipolar world. We mostly are aware of how to choose partners under bipolarity or unipolarity. So what the EU, Brazil, and Latin America should be doing is thinking about how to work together in a world that we still don't have categories to define how we work together and to what extent we can work together. So in many ways it is a world of new paradigms. This is very much also the view from Brazil, so it's not just mine, but it is also a way that currently Brazilian international relations academia is trying to understand the world. So all these things are very relevant to today's topic, but I will simplify, I suppose, by starting to talk a bit about the current state of EU-Brazil relations and a few of those major issues that are currently being discussed. Now, EU-Brazil relations are currently seen generally under three different formats. So on the one hand, we have the strictly bilateral, well, not really if one considers the EU as a multilateral organization, but we have the EU-Brazil level. We have the Brazil individual member state level, and we also have the interregional level, and here I'm referring to the EU-Mercosur negotiations, but also the EU's involvement with LAC or EU-CELAC dialogue. So we have three different levels. What is quite interesting about Brazil in this region is that Brazil is the only state that has a strategic partnership with the European Union. Mexico has one too, but I'm thinking of South America when I say region now. It's another issue for me in Argentina, in Latin America and Brazilian relations in general, that Brazil always likes to refer to South America, whereas Latin America creates its identity in a different way. But to begin with this strategic partnership, as many of you know, it was established in 2007, and it is perhaps, trade aside, the most significant instrument in EU-Brazil relations. It is a non-binding partnership, but is more of a high agreement to discuss on the highest level on a series of issues. And it is based on the premise, both from the EU side but also from Brazil, that these two actors in the international environment have a series of shared values, probably the most pronounced among them being multilateralism and democracy. And this attempt to open towards Brazil came principally from the European Commission, following up on two things. The first one was the 2003 European Security Strategy, which clearly articulated that effective multilateralism could not be attained if the EU were not to open to strategic partners. It left that to be defined, who is strategic and who is not, but it mentioned some. Interestingly, in 2003, it did not mention Brazil as a strategic partner. So one element is this decision to pursue multilateralism through partnerships from the European Union, and that comes with a long story of the failure of Iraq and a lot of security-related issues. And the second is Brazil's boom in the 2000s, economic predominantly, very much as a result of the commodities boom and of decisions made by the Lula government. A small, perhaps, element that facilitated the signature of this partnership was the Portuguese presidency in 2000 of the European Union in 2007, coinciding with a Portuguese president of the European Commission. So there's always that element that leads to agreements. And 2007, we have the strategic partnership established in Brazil, which predicted a series of joint summits, high-level dialogue annually, on an array of issues that, of course, does not include trade, as Brazil is bound by Mercosur in its trade discussions. But it includes a lot of issues related to security, sustainable development, science, technology, innovation, education, and regional cooperation. And that's interesting for the region because, in a way, it has been characterized as this instrument that pushed Brazil, or should have, according to the EU, pushed Brazil to become a leader and an architect in regional integration, whereas Brazil itself, if you speak to Itamaraty, was resistant to the idea that it should necessarily be a leader. It aimed to be an equal in South America, at least that is the discourse in Itamaraty. The perceived leadership of Brazil in the EU does not necessarily resonate with Brazil's self-perception in the region, or at least this is the way that it is seen in Itamaraty. So the gradual summits have had an agenda based on the initial issues, but they have been affected to an extent by the crisis that hit the European Union and the change in the relative leverage that Brazil and the EU represented globally. So as we look at the agendas of the meetings that followed up, the 6 meetings that have followed up from the signature of the strategic partnership, we can see that there is gradually more attention attributed to the issues related to the crisis. So in fact, the annual dialogue became very much an instrument to discuss about the global governance, global financial governance, pre-preparation of what was going to be said within the G20. So there was that element that very much dominates these summits. That aside, it tried to push forward this agenda that I mentioned before regarding finding agreement in areas where EU and Brazil would work together within multilateral fora. And I'll talk a bit about individual areas in a bit. But also within these forums, we also saw gradually an increasing expectation of the European Union that Brazil assume responsibility as a global actor. So we saw in the discussions within the summits some pressure for Brazil to assume a more stronger position regarding the IMF decisions about the countries in crisis in Europe. We saw some pressure for Brazil later on to assume a position regarding the humanitarian crisis in the Middle East. So there has been a sense within these meetings, according to those who have participated, that on the one hand, Brazil has become more significant in defining the agenda, but on the other hand, the EU has used this as a forum to tell Brazil that it should have a more, it should have a bigger piece of the responsibility pie in global settings, and at times this has created difficulties. Now I wanted to start with talking a bit about security and how things are at the moment, just as an area that the EU and Brazil have attempted and had difficulties in cooperating, and then move on to some other issues. So with regards to security, the strategic partnership and the relation between the EU and Brazil suggests that dialogue should be building constructive consensuses between the two countries on global security matters. And in fact, this is the first year where the two have established a high-level dialogue on international peace and security. However, in spite of the efforts to create institutions that Brazil and the EU can work within together on security, we have a number of pending issues that make this hard. For one, the definition of sovereignty versus human rights in the two discourses vary significantly. I think one of the biggest stumbling stones for the two entities to work together, the EU and Brazil, has been the predominance and the defense of sovereignty in the states in the Middle East on behalf of Brazil, while the EU was promoting the idea of intervention. The fact that Brazil does not support sanctions in Iran, that Brazil resisted very much the idea of sanctions in Syria. It abstained from Resolution 1973 in Libya. We've seen within this forum of the annual meetings the EU trying to promote the discourse of intervention, and then Brazil promoting the discourse of sovereignty. And in many ways, this debate was also captured in the presentation of the responsibility while protecting by Foreign Minister Patriota and the President Dilma Rousseff 2 years ago, which the EU expressed interest in, but did not full-fledgedly support. The idea that the norms of intervention, norms of collective security in R2P should be reconsidered and revisited to integrate more of an element of sovereignty in them. That's a very short description of RWP, and Foreign Minister Patriota would probably not like it, but I'm just giving you a very short version. So there is this issue which, in spite then of the willingness to work together that is rhetorically given, has created a lot of problems in cooperating within international collective security issues, and that, of course, in itself leads to the problem of Brazil's greatest demand to have a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council. Of course, England and France have always pronounced themselves as being in favor of that, but it does raise an issue that the EU as an entity has raised, which is that Brazil needs to demonstrate more responsibility if it is to have such a position. Other issues related to security that the EU and Brazil are currently in discussions with are, of course, the issue of the South Atlantic, and I know it's very relevant to Argentina as well, both in terms of militarization and demilitarization, but also in terms of piracy, the exploration of resources. The EU is currently issuing, through the Parliament predominantly, documents regarding a new EU approach to the South Atlantic, and in Brazil that is seen with a bit of reluctance. So the idea is to discuss where and what is possible to do together and what is not. And there, of course, we stumble upon the problem of NATO's global strategy, which still is seen in Brazil as very much an infringement upon the sovereignty of the South Atlantic, and we have had numerous debates in Brazil about the ability to or not to do anything with NATO, because of course operationally the Ministry of Defense acknowledges the need to have more tools at their disposal, but in terms of principles it clashes with the principal approach regarding the South Atlantic. Other issues that are on the security still, security sector reform in Africa, that is something that the EU and Brazil are both doing, and it seems to be working. This also feeds into something I'll mention later, which is the trilateral cooperation for development. We have, I think, seen more progress in these terms of initiatives between the EU and Brazil than in any other, working together in Africa. And this includes both development in the strict sense, but also security sector reform, the decision to work together for monitoring electoral processes. That is one part of EU-Brazil relations that is working. Security finally includes currently a discussion on cybersecurity. This is Brazil's reaction to the espionage that you mentioned. We still don't have any real pronouncements on behalf of the EU on how it views Brazil's attempt currently and decision to pursue an agenda set in Rome in the architecture of the global governance of the internet. This is something that came out of our President's discourse in the United Nations, and following the attempt to introduce RWP, I think this this area of cybersecurity and how to regulate the cyberspace is going to be Brazil's next big project as an agenda setter and a norm entrepreneur in international relations. We don't have a pronouncement yet on the side of the EU on this. I'm sure it will be an issue to discuss in the next high-level dialogue, which will probably be, which is in 2 months actually. But we still don't have a reaction. As you know, the EU itself has been a victim of espionage by the United States. Everyone has, I suppose. But if one looks at the reactions to it in Europe and in Brazil, it is easy to see that there is a normative discordance about the way this should be treated, because Germany symbolically cancelled an agreement that it had with the United States in 1967 about espionage, but it was a very soft move reaction, whereas in Brazil, as you have seen, the reactions are quite strong, including the postponement of the President's visit. But I think in many ways it may be an area to cooperate, not because necessarily of agreement, but because of the necessity for Brazil to use European technology if it is to develop some more ideas about governing the cyberspace without involving the United States, because it is a fact that 94%, I think, if I'm not mistaken, of the world's patents today are either created in the EU or the US. So if we're not using one of them, we're supposed to have the other one clearly. Now, this is, I think, largely the picture about security cooperation, not very rosy because of the normative discordance, but definitely a commitment on both sides to multilateralism, to international law, and to the United Nations. I would say, if I were to judge, more of a problem of interpretation of the values that are upholding on the two sides and discussing together the terms and defining the terms on which they would have to work. Now, regarding trade and investment, which is the other area, and here it's not so much the strategic partnership that I would refer to, but rather the volume bilaterally, but also the regulation of trade, which will come through an EU-Mercosur agreement. And when it comes to investment, it has been an issue of the strategic partnership as well, since it is something that can be negotiated outside. Now, a few numbers I wanted to show here. So, as you probably know, for Brazil, the European Union represents the main destination of exports. You can see there, this is the next slide actually. So, you can see there what the EU imports from Brazil. Largely, as expected, it is non-industrial products, so it's a lot of food and crude minerals, etc. And by contrast, the European Union exports to Brazil, and here we have largely machinery, transport equipment, and manufactured goods. So this is the picture right now. And of course, for Brazil, the EU represents the main destination of exports. It is its main trading partner, representing approximately 23% of Brazil's total trade. And at the same time, the EU is the main foreign investor in Brazil, representing around 40% of FDI in Brazil. So it's quite a significant player in trade and investment. There has been a decrease because of the crisis of those numbers in absolute terms. We also have to remember that in January 2012, Brazil's trade balance registered its biggest deficit in 39 years. Also, because of the fall of commodity prices, but also largely because of the decrease of exports to the EU. So the crisis has affected numbers, but by and large, we still have the EU as the most important trade partner of Brazil. China is very close at the moment. China has surpassed the United States, and it's very close to the EU. It's kind of a battle between people who analyze the numbers, which one is on top, China or the EU. But I would say that this is by and large the picture. And I think it's also quite interesting to see the sort of the course of Brazil and EU trade, mostly because if one looks here, one can see that we have had a relative decrease in the last few years, and the way to explain that, of course, would be this, which is that we've had exports to China increase largely, and here's a close-up to 2000 to 2012. We can see China growing quite a lot, and at the same time, too short. And at the same time, imports from China also growing as imports from the EU decrease. Same picture. Sorry. Thank you. All this to say, there has been some substitution of the trade coming from China, quite a lot. We have had a relative increase from imports from Latin America, but by and large the trend regarding EU-Brazil relations, that is the issue of the day. We have had a relative loss of relevance, but still being the major trade partner. So I think this is something to keep in terms of what the two will want to do together. In spite of the financial crisis, the EU remains this important partner. And while in the past 4 years we have seen Brazil increasingly confident in terms of dealing with the EU negotiating trade volumes, etc. Because of Brazil's increase of trade with other areas such as China, all the BRIC countries actually, and the region. This was the first year, January 2013, where in the meeting with the EU, Brazil expressed concern about its trade balance and concern about its investment, the investments received. And we had a renewed commitment by the EU and Brazil to boost trade and investment together. It is also worth saying that within the course of the years that we have had annual high-level meetings between Brazil and the EU, we have had a reversal of the relationship in that now Brazil is also a big investor in Europe. So Brazil is now the 5th biggest investor in the European Union, and of course the European Union is the biggest investor in Brazil. So in terms of investment, we have had, so there's a strategic relevance of the two, and this renewed vigor in discussing investments has also come from the business communities in both areas, which have taken a significant task within the bilateral summits in promoting an agenda that will further boost investment. And alongside with that, this has been a very business forums, business associations have been one of the most the strongest voices in arguing that Brazil should push for the conclusion of the Mercosur-EU association agreement. We saw this very much this year in the EU-Brazil summit, and the EU-SELAC summit actually, a strong business voice to conclude the negotiations with Mercosur, because it is believed in Brazil that this would, for Brazil, increase the volume of trade with the EU by about 25%, which is very significant. So these are some of the justifications, and a final important interest in Brazil is that this EU-Mercosur agreement be concluded, because it will bring in tools in order to boost innovation in Brazil. A big preoccupation of Brazil in its discussions with the EU is the relative imbalance in terms of the ability to produce homemade technology, to produce patents, the necessity to have a freer intellectual property rights regime from the EU, and all these can be negotiated within an EU-Mercosur agreement. And of course, that's another motivation. This is apart from the EU, but Brazil is at the moment preoccupied in terms of its economy, and as you've seen, inflation is growing. We have current account imbalances are growing. The government is at the moment quite dependent on external financing for public spending, and the current economic environment is not particularly helpful. And one solution to all this would be to develop infrastructure, to develop homegrown technology, and of course to reduce the Brazil cost for foreign investments, which at the same time, of course, would challenge domestic products, so it's a bit of a trap. But all these issues could be solved through the right negotiation with the EU, is the belief in Brazil. But that, of course, is a long way to go, and it would have to take into consideration the rest of the Mercosur partners, but it kind of explains the logic of those within Brazil who want to see this agreement concluded, and of course, resistance in other areas. Now, moving from trade to other areas that EU and Brazil are working together, I'd like to point to the one that I said is working, which is trilateral cooperation for development in Africa. While most of the other areas of our bilateral collaboration have been condemned as not very functional, apart from investment that obviously is quite high, is Brazil and the EU working together for the promotion of democratic processes in Africa, for the promotion of development in Africa, for the promotion of biofuels, technology development in Africa. We have seen all of these points, Brazil working together with the EU, working together with African countries as successful operations, for example, in Mozambique or in other Portuguese-speaking countries. Recently, the EU and Brazil have agreed together to support electoral participation and citizenship development in Portuguese-speaking Africa. Of course, again, regarding this development cooperation, there are normative differences between the EU and Brazil. The EU countries, particularly the ones that have the largest development cooperation participation, such as the United Kingdom, are part of the OECD donor committee, and that subscribes by certain rules that and norms that Brazil does not accept, such as using development as a means to promote certain norms, and this infringes upon Brazil's perception of sovereignty for the African countries. So Brazil is much more involved in a technical project of cooperation rather than a normative project. And that, of course, is an issue between traditional donors and emerging donors in general. But trilateral cooperation is mostly solving this. The other thing about trilateral cooperation in Africa is that many times it is not EU-Brazil that are working together, but it's individual member state countries working together. So we've seen, for example, a lot of UK-Brazil activism in that area. And that leads to questions again about who is the EU and can we work with the EU as a whole or with countries. A lot of these things that I mentioned feed into the normative issues about the relationship between the EU and Brazil in terms of what the two entities mean by the values and the principles that they define as mutual, such as multilateralism, such as human rights, such as regional integration and its promotion, what kind of regional integration. Social equality, I think, is the one that they mostly seem to define in the same way, and we've recently seen Brazil converse with certain European leaders, but also the IMF, are not including that as a part of the IMF's considerations. But there is an issue of resolving terms when we're talking about EU-Brazil relations and cooperation, if we are to proceed forward with certain things. And the other issue, of course, is to understand what we mean by reform of global governance, which is something that is always placed within the texts of agreement between the two. So rhetorically and discursively, it's there, everyone is committed to it. But when it comes to the realities of reforming global governance, there are a lot of stumbling stones. Brazil did get its IMF quotas, but that was not an easy decision for the EU. Trade multilateralism, which is supported by both, is for Brazil now being challenged by the EU, which is entering a number of trade agreements, including perhaps most importantly the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with the United States, which is seen as an attempt to boycottage the Doha round, and Brazil is not convinced that this is supportive for trade multilateralism. There is the issue of the Security Council reform that I mentioned, the global governance of cyberspace, and even in the global governance of climate, we have two voices that seem to agree, but then when it comes to emission caps on developed industrialized countries, still we have disparities in agreement. So it's very much an issue of defining the terms. Now, of course, I have run out of time because there's still not too much time left, but what I'd like to do for my conclusion is sort of bring Latin America in. And what does the EU see when it sees Brazil and then it sees Latin America? Well, the EU sees as fuzzy a picture, I think, as countries in this region see when they look at the EU and the various countries. With the difference that this fuzzy picture is not fuzzy because of the many countries and the fact that they are integrated, but it's because they are not integrated. So what the EU sees when it looks at this region, it sees Brazil that it has a strategic partnership with, and Mexico that it has a strategic partnership with. One of them is a Mercosur member, the other one is not. With one of them it has a free trade agreement, with the other one it doesn't. It has the Mercosur negotiations going on. It has a number of free trade agreements with non-Mercosur members, such as Peru and Colombia and Chile, basically the Pacific Alliance countries. So that is a bit of an interesting matrix. It also sees a region that it partially still gives aid to in certain parts. There's a green in this on my computer, but it doesn't show there, so it's a little hard to see what it is, but you get the picture. It also sees an area that receives foreign direct investment from the EU, specifically certain countries. As here is just exemplary how the EU is actually the biggest investor in the region, and even though we have had significant effects on United States and Canada investment after the global crisis, we don't have this effect very much in the EU. It continues to be a major investor. And interestingly, we also have a region that invests in the EU, and here I think it's really striking how much investment by Brazil in the EU has grown, and this new element of Colombia. So it is a region that is significant in trade, significant as investment, and of course something that we cannot graph is that it is a region with which, probably more than any other region, the EU can look for joint values in terms of global governance and security, abiding to democracy, abiding to human rights, the rule of law, upholding international law. That cannot be graphed. But it is quite tricky because all these regional formats of groups of various types, institutionalized, non-institutionalized, are confusing for an external actor. We tried to map the types of groupings of Latin American countries that the EU has mentioned in certain documents with some of my students, and we had 27 groups relevant that they mentioned, even though not institutionalized necessarily, but it included, ALBA, it included some kind of association of the Latin American left, and they come up in the documents of the EU. So the image is quite confusing. We were trying to make a cloud, it didn't work, so we did this. It's kind of, we're not there yet with technology. But I think the biggest dividing barrier nowadays, or perhaps for the future, is this declining ability to engage with Mercosur in terms of trade, and the increasing ability to engage with the Pacific Alliance. And The Economist, again, had an interesting article in May 2013 about the regionalisms in South America, and kind of a battle of regionalisms and ideologies, and which one will triumph, which I think is very counterproductive for the region. But it did resonate with the Europeans and the Americans. And they are currently shifting attention, in terms of trade at least, to the Pacific Alliance, albeit an area which is still not as big in terms of trade volume as the Mercosur and other countries, but it's still increasing. They have signed free trade agreements. I don't want to go through this, but what I think is interesting is I was having a conversation with the former Mexican foreign minister, and we were talking about this, and he said, yes, but the Pacific Alliance is still so far from having as much trade with the EU as the Mercosur does. So we did a graph, and actually it's not that far. So my point being that the current environment is favorable to regional integration. It's favorable to fast and effective and flexible negotiations. And the EU is just one actor that is looking for that type of understanding of South America. And I had a lot of things to say that I cannot say, but my final point was that Argentina and Brazil are pivotal in creating the kind of momentum in a regional organization in South America that could work with the EU, not only trade-wise, but also security-wise, in terms of uploading norms to global governance. Signing an agreement does not necessarily mean accepting someone's imposition, but also being able to create norms and create rules. But what I think is necessary for the region is to work together to go back to the norms and rules that characterize all of the region. And these are not just trade rules, they are democracy rules, they are law-related, they have to do with how the world should be governed, how the G20 should be seen since it represents the region, how the United Nations should be acting. So I think the whole story of the EU and South America, apart of saying a lot of other things, says that if Brazil is now involved in a relationship that is half working with the EU because it was given strategic partner status, if the region were to get it together and work together, then that could be used not to Brazil's advantage, but to the region's advantage. And I think I'll stop here and not say all the other stuff because I don't have time, but I hope this has been helpful. Thank you.